Okay, thank you, Lauren, for this introduction, and hello, everyone. This morning, we heard from the keynote addresses the importance of studying agriculture and food systems in more cohesive way, in more inclusive way. And then we had a presentation by Kavita and the session that we all worked very diligently on that TEEBAgriFood framework application. We learned about what is the framework. So Kavita explained it. Here is a framework that includes natural capital, social capital, human capital, and produced capital. So today I'm going to talk about how to apply the framework, drawing on from some of the experiences that we had while writing this chapter on applications in the scientific and foundations report. And also, as Lauren mentioned, we have made quite a lot progress since then. I think the foundations report came out in June last year. And by the time it was launched, I think several of the studies were already underway. And I will highlight a couple of those studies as well, give you like some idea of where we are moving in this direction in application, because this is very important. When we framework provides like theoretical understanding, theoretical framework, but we have to go out in the field, apply, so that policymakers, practitioners, they can make a decision about agriculture or food policies. And I think it's very important, and I feel very happy to be involved by UN Environment and supported by Global Alliance to present this work so that I can get the feedback from the policy community, from the practitioner community as well, so that we can improve these assessments. So I think if you are familiar with the Foundations report, there was chapter 8 on the applications of the framework. And at that time, when we applied the framework, it was not the application of the framework. We looked into some studies. So it was an initial exploration of the framework. So what we did was we looked into like a global database of various studies done in agriculture and food sectors. And we selected a handful of studies, about 10 studies. We selected which demonstrated good information, good data. And we wanted to do some kind of analysis that, okay, these studies have been done, they have been completed, peer-reviewed, and published. And now if we apply that data into the framework, how does it look like? And what we can learn from that analysis. So in writing this chapter, which was on the initial exploration of the applications, I was supported by a team of my colleagues. Barbara is sitting here. There was Willie from Wageningen, and Ariane and Renee from FAO, and several of reviewers who contributed to this chapter. So it was like a very intensive like exercise to narrow down to 10 case studies which demonstrate some kind of applications. So this was not that, okay, we have applied the framework right away. So this is while writing the foundations report, framework is being developed, and then we found out some case studies which are relevant to gain some understanding about the what it looks like in practice. And then I will also highlight a couple of examples that what progress we have made since then. So evaluation framework, as you can see, can be applied throughout the value chain studies. The intent is to capture all 4 capitals and internalize the value of nature in our agriculture and food sector. So I think with this background, we prescribed 5 applications of the framework. So what are these 5 families? So 5 families are agricultural management systems, so that policymakers or practitioners can apply in a setting of comparing management system. I think this morning there was a question about comparing organic and conventional systems. So yes, that's a number 1 family where production systems. You can compare a couple of production systems or a multiple production systems by using the framework. And then you can, policymakers can incentivize a system which brings more positive outcomes for the society as well as for the community. And then next application is about the products. So products could be evaluating product A, which is organic milk versus conventional milk, or palm oil from RSPO certified unit or a conventional unit, or you can compare grass-fed beef or a grain-fed beef. So this is coming from the business side or from the product side. So again, consumers can make a decision about which product they want to support. And the third was dietary comparison. So dietary comparison is about, there are a variety of diets, ranging from vegetarian diet to meat-based diet, and then vegans, and several other diets, Mediterranean diet, which can be promoted, but we need to evaluate that diet. What are the key ingredients in that diet? What are the positive or negative externalities while producing or prescribing those diets? So we need that kind of information before we can actually suggest that this particular diet is best for this particular condition. So the fourth application is about evaluating policy. So at a country scale, you have a policy A, subsidizing agricultural inputs, versus policy B, which does not exist, I think, in most of the countries. But if there is any policy to support incentives for organic farming or for agroecological farming, we need a kind of a comparison. So this framework we can utilize in comparing policy A versus policy B, and then incentivize those practices and policies. And also, the most important thing is GDP is not going to go away. This is the only measure for economic success, but we can bring in natural capital, social capital, and human capital into it. And in national accounting, we can account for these other capitals which do not exist there, and how to do that. So there are five different families of application. I think that is the mantra which Pawan gave, and he asked us to find different case studies which can fit into these categories, these 5 families, and so this chapter evolved gradually over a period of time. So at the end, we managed to collect information about 10 case studies, 2 in each of the 5 families. So in agricultural management system, we had one study which compared organic and conventional agriculture, then various management systems of rice production. In products, we had beef production, palm oil study. Then in dietary comparison, we had a case study from USA as well as from France. Then we had a policy evaluation for pesticide tax, and also one of the case studies where a big policy in Yangtze River basin from the Chinese ecosystem assessment. And in national accounting, we had 2 studies, one from agricultural development in Senegal, as well as environmental economic accounts in Australia. So we had these 10 decent case studies in 5 applications, and we elaborated them, and we applied the data which was already analyzed in these case studies and applied it to our framework, just to see how it looks like. So I will go through a couple of examples. So if you look into rice management practices, whatever information at that stage was available, we mapped into our TEEBAgriFood framework. So these are the outcomes. So outcomes from natural capital as well as human capital. And these are green indicates it's more of a quantitative information. It's not monetized information. For produced capital, agriculture input outputs, there is plenty of monetary information available. Whereas impacts on ecosystem services, it's only descriptive. So there's not much data in that particular case study. And you can see lots of gray cells, which is those studies did not capture these cells or these important parameters. So it does not mean we are criticizing that particular study. We are just looking into what they have done without the framework. And then we looked into a diet comparison. Can we look into consumption side or production or processing side? And then we did find a case study where, based in USA, where they evaluated 10 different diets. But as you can see, there is a very little quantitative or monetary information. It's more descriptive, and it's not monetary evaluation of all aspects of diet, and lots of gray cells again. So we learned important lessons. that framework can apply, extend its remit in not just bringing in quantitative or monetary information, but we can have descriptive information and dig into the assessment or analysis. And then for trade-off analysis, comparing two systems need a comprehensive set of data. So data gaps were still there. So yeah, that was a good learning that we need robust data to compare two systems. And most of the time, if it is an agronomic study or agronomy, it is about yield. So nothing about social impact or ecosystem services or other environmental impacts. So normally these studies are done in isolation. So there is a one, I think Alexander mentioned, one is just looking into agronomy, one is just looking into how much money you can make, and they don't talk to each other. So this was like some of the lessons that we learned while writing this chapter. And now I would like to share two examples of what advances have been made since then. And with the support of Global Alliance, there are two studies which are going on at the moment. One is Mississippi River Basin, looking into corn and from the management or the production side, and farming systems in UK. So this is where I would like to share some of the observations. Our report will come out probably in April and later on. So I just want to give you a picture. I don't want to preempt our report, and I just want to give you a glimpse that, okay, what advances we have made, what lessons we have learned, and how to move this field forward. So if you look into corn study, what is important from agronomic point of view? Like a high yield, that is all the inputs, that is all produced capital. Outputs, which is like if I get a high yields, that's fine, I'm happy. If I get more income, I'm happy. So that's again very limited. So that's how any corn study would do. Like what is the total area, what is the total production, what is the total money or income it generates. But when we apply the framework, you can see most of the cells are filled with information. So I don't expect you to read this information. Right now, the report will be available in April and later on. But as you can see, there is plenty of monetary information, quantitative information in the production side, because our intent was to evaluate GM corn production system versus organic or any alternative production system. So you can see lots of quantitative information in this area. What are the capital stocks? What are the flows? What are the residual flows? What are the social inequities? What are the health aspects? What are the health costs? And then extend it in the value chain, which is mostly descriptive. So yeah, given in our particular project, our focus was on agricultural management systems. So one of the 5 applications that I mentioned. So what's the outcome of this study? So this would be the outcome if it is just an economic or agronomic study. So I would be interested to know, in Minnesota state of US, GM corn production area is 7.6 million as compared to like 28,000 acres in organic. And the money it makes is $4.5 billion every year if you produce GM corn. It's a good value for the state. And organic corn makes about 30 millions. But with the application of the framework, we have got environmental cost. What's the figure? We have got health cost. Any guess? So we were able to quantify this environmental cost and health cost in our production system. So I'm not going to reveal these figures, but I can share it with you. These are enormous health and environmental costs. And we just looked into the production side, and we could not look into the consumption side and the processing side. So there are, with the application of the framework, we advanced our assessment, our analysis. So when we come across these studies, we can make a quick analysis that which system to incentivize, what practices to follow so that we are not increasing our environmental cost and health cost, we are managing them, we are reducing them. So there were several lessons learned in this exercise. One is we found this TEEBAgriFood framework really very interesting and very relevant for our analysis, and we could nail some of the issues about health cost, about the environmental cost of corn production system. But definitely there is need to develop some guidelines for practitioners and policymakers. Practitioners here is farmers. So I had this type of meeting in Minnesota, and the farmers asked, okay, we understand this information, but what should we do now? So I did not have any answer to that. So I want some kind of reflections on these type of questions which we have to face when we go out and work with farmers. That yes, they are concerned about the environmental and health aspects of their farming because they know that they are putting millions of tons of fertilizers and pesticides or weedicides every year on their piece of land. But what is the mechanism, what is the alternative, and how to do that? I think that's the very important question that that was a lesson which we learned, that we need that kind of information somewhere to inform farming community. So quickly, I would like to go about another dimension of the applications, again, farm management side. This is a work in partnership with Sustainable Food Trust based in UK. And we developed a farm matrix based on this framework on natural capital, social, human, and produced capital. We wanted to communicate the findings to farmers. If farmer wanted to evaluate their farming system or their farm, there is no one single system which can evaluate their farm. So this work was started a couple of years ago, and at the same time, TEEBAgriFood framework was developing. So there was integration, there was a cross-fertilization of ideas, and we came up with a matrix which is, again, the basis is all those 4 capitals, and then several indicators for each of the capital. And when we collect data at a farm level and put it into this matrix, and it gives an information in this format. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where is the soil in this farm? It is 4.5, which is like in the middle range. It's an average. A farmer can understand that, yes, its soil is not like above average. It's like needs to do something about its improvement of soil organic carbon or soil health or other indicators in that soil. And if there is a social capital, which is like community networks, farmers are involved in multiple educational networks or other community events, they get high score for that. So they can see that, okay, where they are now and how they can plan in future. So in 3 years, they want to build soil, they want to build the quality of air or water quality or biodiversity, they can plan. So this is another filtering of this framework and an application right for a farmer. So any farmer can use this information, have an assessment in a given year 1, and then revisit in year 3 and see what changes they have made. So framework is not all theoretical. So at the same time, we have developed these applications which are very, very highly practical. And you can develop different summaries from your results. And the lessons learned are, again, that yes, communication of this information to market, how consumers are going to receive this. Are they going to support a meat product or a wheat or any other product from a farm that is high on air quality, good on social capital or human capital or not? So that is where I think we need to fill in those gaps. And definitely for different practices, we need some benchmarks so that you can see that, okay, my farm is better than X farm is better than Y farm, and how to improve some of the indicators. So at the end, I would like to have some reflections while going through the development of the chapter, which were without the framework. So we applied that analysis. from the existing case studies and from what we have done so far. I think there are some good points which we learned, that we need to scope out the study very carefully and very clearly, what we are doing, what is the objective. So is it just comparison of the system so that we publish that finding or not? Or is it is comparing the system for practitioners so that they can change their decision. So decision making is very important. Whom are we targeting our case study or whatever the analysis? Or is it for a national policy or a local policy? Quality of data is always a problem, but you have to find out based your assessment on the existing literature, but there should be some avenue or some resources to develop a new database or new data sets. I think that will be very important. And one other finding was about multidisciplinary approach for this assessment. So like we always say that we don't want all agronomists working for this system. There should be an agronomist, there should be one environment scientist or economist, as well as someone from the health side and from social sciences as well. We were lucky that in our US Corn study, we covered like amongst us, I think we covered most of these specializations. So if you have a multidisciplinary teams, I think the assessment could generate some really interesting outcomes. And the last point is dealing with so what. That is still unresolved. I don't have any answer. I think we need, as a community, we need to engage with practitioners and policymakers to find out what do we do with this information and how to change, how to transform. So Lauren mentioned that by 2022, we want to transform food and agriculture systems. That's an ambitious goal, yes, but we have some tools, but we want to develop that pathway. So what is that pathway which we can all adopt, and then we can utilize this framework, which is a solid framework to evaluate agriculture and food systems. Okay, I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention. We are not taking questions.
I'm looking at the organizers for some advice on time. It would be really nice to take a few questions for...
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Can we do that? Harpinder, why don't you stay and we'll...
We need a microphone for the speaker for the interpretation, please.
Yeah, if there are any, I'm happy to. Otherwise.
Any questions?
No?
Just, Harpinder, what was the main challenge dealing with applying the framework for those case studies? Did you come across some?
I think the main challenge I mentioned was multidisciplinary team. You need a team which is wide enough to have a health experts, social scientists, agronomists, ecologists, and we were lucky that we came in contact with, although it was geographically very difficult to manage this type of project, but we were lucky to have that multidisciplinary focus. And obviously, data does exist on most of the indicators. If there is something I think you can generate some of the data as well. You can do some analysis. So it's not just based on secondary data. So data and multidisciplinary focus were the main challenges so far.
Hi, Fleur from True Price. First of all, thank you. It's very interesting to hear. I also appreciated the different types of applications that you discussed. It's very interesting also to see the farmer tool or the different skills. And I was just wondering if you have any ideas on how you're going to communicate this to farmers without losing the interconnectivity, because I saw, for instance, soil is a different one and productivity, and if you increase productivity, what does that do to all the other ones? That was my question with the...
Yeah, that's very interesting, because most of the farmers, they do ask these type of questions that, okay, should I change my focus on improving soil and biodiversity, for which no one is going to pay, or should I continue to increase my yield potential? So that's where I think we need those kind of linkages from market and from policy are there any incentives to change that practice? So there is no point of talking to a farmer that you are going to lose your income, but it will be very good for our society and health and biodiversity for everything else. No farmer is going to do that. So you need that mechanism, which I don't have the answer for that, but it could be from market as an incentive. We have seen in organics that it works. So similarly for agroecology, what is the incentive? If consumers are aware, probably they are going to support in any way. They are happy to pay a little bit more premium for what they are consuming. But we cannot take it for granted that we're talking about 10 billion people. And in this room, I think we'll be able to support that produce, but 10 billion people won't be able to buy that food. 1 billion still struggle to have any access of food. So I think that mechanism is required. So there is a market as well as government. So that has to come into play. And in the UK case studies, I think and the Sustainable Food Trust is working with the government as well as with people in the market, like big supermarket chains, that if we communicate this finding to you, would you increase the premium for this produce versus that produce? So it has to go alongside, to get some positive outcomes. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yes. Well, maybe we'll take 2 more questions, and then there will be time afterwards as well.
Thanks, Harpinder. Just to ask, clearly, thinking about the Minnesota study, there'd be, if this, once you publish this, there will be pushback because of the figures that you've produced. Now, I mean, I've been a researcher, it's very difficult to develop numbers, and we always have to try our best. But if this went to an environmental economist who had a contrarian position, who basically wanted to support, say, the GM audience, would he or she be able to easily and readily discredit the numbers because they're depending on benefits transfer and say a very small number of data points, but you're basically extrapolating to the entirety of Minnesota? Is that potentially a problem?
Yeah, I think that's always the case in this type of research where you are limited with your resources that you can do. It was impossible to do statewide, USA statewide, so we focused on Minnesota where our most of the audience was. And I think it's not about scientific journal. I think there is the information or the data we have generated is quite robust in that sense, statistically as well. So we won't have that issues with maybe some journals, but not other journals, just for the publications. But I think the whole idea of the report was to communicate that there is other linkages or other aspects of corn farming system which are missing. So people just are interested in corn prices per bushel in the stock exchange, trade of corn, probably export of corn, and how much area is going to be under corn in a given year. But we have brought this new aspect that there is an environment and health cost which are quite significant. And we did not look into the causation ratio because that's very difficult to justify. So we looked into if the corn intensity increases, there is increase in health cost. So that was very different from, which is like a subjective well-being valuation approach. So it's not linking that if you eat corn, you will get sick. If corn intensity increases by 1%, the health cost decreases by about 0.67. So it's a huge implication for all people living in that area. So it is like, it depends on, it's a big question to change the US Farm Bill on the basis of this one study. But it's like, it's a one drop in the ocean, but we are going in a right direction. So given 6 months ago, we had this report and lots of applications are coming out. And we have got a panel here who will talk about other studies on maize and India, and wheat in India and livestock in Brazil. So I think we are heading in right direction, and the idea of this symposium is to get that feedback. So if we are doing something wrong, so guide us in that particular direction. So, yeah.
Sir, there's a new interface in the production system, in the value chain. I'm talking about after the farmer, the certification systems and standards organizations which are sort of controlling the market. They decide on product sustainability that is emanating from the consumer. Did you sort of see this in your analysis, and do you think that they play so much role that we should take consideration of their existence?
I think our study was more oriented towards what's happening on the ground in the production side. But if I get your question right, there are like organizations who are already controlling the input market and the food market, which is, we could not reach out to them in this particular study. So we were mostly focused on the production side. Does that answer your question, or is it completely different? Yes. I didn't get your question.
You didn't get my question. I'm saying that in the value chain, there's blocks of institutions that are featuring now. They are working so much in some of the value chains, and like certification bodies and standard organizations, and they matter. As a matter of course, in product sustainability and quality-wise, and which is all drawn from the strength from the consumer. Did you sort of see this in your analysis, or it didn't matter for you?
So we just, as I mentioned, mostly looking into the production side, so we did not led our analysis to the consumption side, but we made some comments. We got some information about what's happening in the value chain and who are the main actors in the value chain and how it impacts there. So it's more of a production side.
Maybe we could have some reactions from the floor, just to get everybody moving this afternoon. Yes, Salman.
I just want to just to help those, well, including myself in some respects, in terms of the studies that are coming up. A general principle in life cycle analysis is that what you do is you basically look at, if you've got a comparison between two alternatives, in this case, organic versus conventional, the only thing you would do is look at the differences. So if, say, for instance, organic versus conventional had the same impact vis-a-vis CO2 emissions, then there's no point really in looking at it, because if you're trying to make a comparison to say which is better, then you wouldn't do so. So it's basically a question, I suppose, mainly to Peter and Harry-Priya, because it seemed that you have retained this kind of comprehensive analysis where you have looked at everything, even in cases where there probably isn't a material difference in terms of the comparison. Now, I wonder, am I correct in saying that you've done that? And I suppose we have to ask ourselves in terms of the TEEBAgriFood community, if we've got a limited resource and a limited amount of time, whether we should be looking at everything if we're making a comparison, but a typology comparison, if there's no difference between the two alternatives.
Well, let me just speak to the comparison we've made. There are very distinct parameters for, say, smallholder and largeholder ranching, for example, that have to do with, which I wasn't able to get into in much depth in my limited time for the presentation, but and the response of the different actors in terms of the incentive prospects are also very different. So the kind of, I think the real question is really, how are we going to target interventions at different actors who are producing under different systems or different scales, and how to promote that as being also responsive to the externalities, as being a factor that may be brought in as an additional value that is not considered. It may not be that the value of production may not be so significantly different, but the benefits to be obtained by the intervention may be significantly different. So I think that may be a justification. I'll pass the buck now.
Yeah, when we looked at the differences, see, the common misunderstanding is that organic cultivation is not profitable, and so the farmers do not adopt it. But then the difference actually comes in the level of the inputs that are being used. For example, if you take out the fertilizers and insecticides, but then organic farms have different kind of pesticides and insecticides that they use. I mean, it's basically plant-based. And the other thing is the amount of manual labor in the organic cultivation is much higher than that of the inorganic. So I think it's important to highlight those differences, but then nevertheless those costs are, maybe the human labor is on a bit on a higher side, but then it is offset by the amount of fertilizers and pesticides being used in other form, and then it has also a higher productivity. The second thing is that because inorganic has minimum support price and there are also a lot of subsidies inherent in fertilizers and pesticides, if the same amount is actually passed in as a price transfer to the organic farmer cultivators, then the organic farming becomes more sustainable than inorganic. So, I mean, to highlight those differences and to tell where to intervene, I think it's important to have the same typology, have like system A, you're comparing two systems, just compare each and every aspect of it in a uniform way so that the policymakers know that yes, everything is on the same ground. Otherwise, if we adopt a different system, then altogether, then you cannot actually give an answer to them. So it's important that we adopt the same typology and highlight where the differences actually come. Yes.
Hello, I'm Pietro from True Price Impact Institute. A question from your testing of the framework. I was wondering, it's very useful you uncover with this framework a lot of facts, you bring them together. Where there are some of your findings that your stakeholders, and specifically the decision makers that you want to influence, they reacted in a way that you didn't expect, like they were very interested in some specific facts that you uncovered. I was wondering, yeah, which of the facts that you uncovered resonated a lot with the decision makers that you are trying to influence? I don't know if the question is clear.
Yeah, I would say that, yeah, there's certainly a very strong interest on the part of ranchers and soybean producers in Brazil to the potential of accessing resources to transform their systems in a more sustainable direction. But they are mostly concerned with their net rents. That's the they may acknowledge that there are differences to be obtained in terms of carbon emissions and in terms of the water quality and other aspects that are indicated. But their principal concern is how much are they going to take home at the end of the day. So we have to try to incentivize a movement that will not only improve their net rents, but also improve the environmental results of the system.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment because, for example, what is very interesting among these campesinos, these smallholder farmers, is that financial returns are only part of the rationale of their or their behavior. So you see a lot of times where if they do just financial cost benefit analysis, these farmers are losing money. But because they do value many other things in their crops, in their maize, for example, cultural identity, special dishes, where markets are not really working, but they're still willing to produce the crop even at what will look as a financial loss. That's what we say in our study, that that's an externality. You're having more maize produced that would have been produced if those producers were just profit-driven. And so it's also very important to understand that there are certain category of farmers, for example, that do things for reasons that are not necessarily reflected in the market. They have economic cost and benefits, but they are not reflected in the market. And because we have, and I think that a lot of things that have to do with diversification are this type of values that are not, as I said, not reflected in prices, which is important to bear in mind.
All right, why don't we take 3 questions now, and then we'll have some reflections based on those. So we'll start with you with the floral.
Jaqueline, Instituto Escolhas, or Charles C. Institute. I appreciate to hear Peter about the other externalities in the livestock and soy chain, in addition to deforestation, and Harpinder about how the use of pesticide has impacted the income of farmers.
Yes, we're going to take a couple more questions. There was at least 2 more questions in that corner. Okay, so Marina?
So my question is also to Peter. Thanks, Peter. I'm sending a lot of good energy for you to be lucky in convincing the government with your study. But my question to you is also about externalities. If you're able to capture the cost of health impact of meat consumption in the Brazilian society, and if you think that this is on the radar of the Brazilian institutions.
And yes.
So, Elash Traore from Senegal. My question is for Dr. Gandimeda. Is right? Okay. You mentioned that byproducts are burned by producer, giving many constraints. My question is that rice straw is not used for animals' nutrition? Okay.
Thank you very much. My question goes to all the 3 presenters. You've applied this framework from an individual commodity perspective. So you have maize, livestock, and wheat. But I'm thinking, what is your experience if you were to apply this framework, from an economy-wide perspective? Do you think there is that possibility? And if so, what sort of changes would you need to apply to the system? Because I'm thinking from a policymaker's perspective, if you were to do this sort of evaluation for all the commodities within an economic system, would require a lot of resources. So is it possible to apply this, from an economy-wide perspective, this evaluation framework? Thank you.
There were specific questions for Peter and Harpinder, but Mauricio, maybe you want to start with just some reflections even on the last question.
Well, I think that the question is that, for example, going back to the whole question of maize, maize is a very, very important crop for Mexican and for Mexican urban and rural. So clearly that's a priority. I cannot answer the question about the economic-wide thing, because always the problem again is context. The broader you go, the less contextual it becomes, and the more irrelevant your analysis becomes. That's the danger. You can make such an aggregate analysis that is worthless, and then, as you pointed out, it can be so narrow that again it would be worthless. So I think that from a policy perspective, it's very important to know how, first of all, where to target. Maybe you don't want to do this analysis for everything, but to target it right, and then to find the right scale at which you have to do it to have meaningful things to tell, and to recommend. That would be my point.
Right. So, as far as the last question is concerned, I think, we're dealing with commodities that have a significance that is par greater, I think, than perhaps than the majority. When you have an agribusiness complex that is maybe 22% of the Brazilian economy, and soybeans is maybe half of that. And beef, you know, I don't even know what beef. Everybody eats so much beef in Brazil, it's ridiculous. 80% of all the beef that's produced in Brazil is consumed in Brazil. But still, there's a lot of beef going to Russia, China, the Near East, on the hoof. So it's being slaughtered according to Muslim practices. 400,000 head of cattle every year. So we're not talking about a small piece of the economy. This is a very large piece of the economy. And any kind of change that can bring about a sort of a more massive adjustment in the way in which soybeans and cattle are produced, that will probably have significant effects on overall emissions of greenhouse gases in Brazil, as well as the quality of life of Brazilian citizens who also consume too much meat. No, I think it was answering Marina that really is there's so much consumption of beef in Brazil. And I think Brazil is the third largest beef consumer in the world after Argentina and Uruguay or something like that. So if Brazilians stop deriving so much of their protein from beef, it would make quite a considerable impact on the demand for beef, and that could also reduce the impacts. As far as the other externalities that we tried to develop as much as we could, there is certainly, as in the case of the Punjab, there are significant problems of respiratory disease in the Brazilian Amazon every year, which we call the burning season. In the burning season, when the forest is put to the torch to expand, mostly ranching, into the Amazon, you can't even land an airplane because it's so dense. There's no way to get into the airport, and people are breathing these residues all the time. So that's one significant impact that we have some measures for in terms of the health impacts. I think the food consumption impact is something we would like to have more information about. What would be the difference for Brazilians in terms of their substituting their picanha for more chicken and fish, for example. That would be a very interesting study to complement what we've already done so far. But we've also looked at insecticide impacts, the impact on pollinators that is also associated with deforestation, and the importance of pollinators to soybeans, which is 30% of soybean productivity is reliant on pollination by bees, basically. And when you deforest, you just don't have any habitat for bees. And when you use insecticides, which is quite frequent in Brazil in the soybean industry, you are killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. So we're losing pollinators in a very big way, and that really needs to be reflected in policy and the kind of action that is underway to change the dimension of forest protection adjacent to large soybean and ranching operations in the Amazon.
Yeah, regarding the question why rice residues are being burnt and why can't it be used as a fodder? Yes, it can't be used as a fodder because the rice, the stalk has high silicon content and the cattle, they don't like it. So as a result, it's not being used. In India, 80% is burnt. Some is made using rope making and some in biomass and all that. But still, because the carrying and transporting is very expensive, and then also like the farmers do not get adequate, so the cost would be higher than the benefits they get by transporting this so that's the main reason why it's burned. And the second thing regarding the impact of the insecticides on output, if they don't apply the insecticide, the crop output would suffer. So the insecticides do not increase the output, but they actually ensure that the output there would not be any attack of pests and diseases. But then when in the production function, when I estimated this, I did find a positive but insignificant relationship. That means they don't really impact the output. But then the farmers tend to over-apply, and then the use of insecticides has been much higher than what has been prescribed. But most of the pests become resistant to this, and that also is another issue, because the farmers think that the more they apply, the better safeguarded they are, but that's not the reality. So that's the issue.
Great. Harpinder, a few closing reflections?
Yeah, I'll touch on that question about application at the national scale or economy-wide scale. I think as one of the 5 families of applications, there is one on national accounts to fix national accounts of agriculture and food sector. So I don't know how to do it, how much resources will be required, but I think the current process of national accounting is that the government statistics department, they already collect that data. So it will be learning from this new tool and then applying it in that context. And the SIA framework was mentioned, and many countries are doing that. In our chapter on applications, we have highlighted one example from Australia. So Australia is already at the forefront, and they are including those natural capital accounts into the national accounts already. There are some good lessons there that you can apply things at an economy-wide scale. So I think there are good positive vibes that yes, it can be done if a country decides about that this framework applications can help them resolve some of the issues. So I think it will definitely require lots of training and resources. But when we look into all the examples we have presented here, so that information is already covered in the stats department. Statistical information is there, so you can apply the framework and make a good assessment out of that. And regarding our focus on commodities, I think it is within 1 year of launching this framework, we have got so many applications going on. So it's about resources and timing and things that, okay, you start with the commodities and then gradually build from there, and maybe some agribusiness or people can join, and maybe we'll have more case study from Natural Capital Coalition or some other organizations who are part of this whole community. And maybe it can be applied at a country-wide scale as well. So I'm quite optimistic about uptake of this whole framework. But it's like GDP was introduced after World War. So everybody was devastated with the state of the affairs all over the world. But they took up one model. GDP is a simple model. Okay, you account for all profits and losses, and you reflect in your accounts every year. And since then, all 200 plus countries are doing it every year. So it is about institutionalizing new practices or new tools into your process. So there is always people will try to push you off that, no, we don't want to use. But with this kind of applications, I think there is some positive outcomes reaching out to the community, to policymakers, that yes, this is something which is beneficial, which can be applied at a broader policy level. So hopefully that will happen sooner, and then we can all work towards contributing to SDGs and rest of the goals in this particular sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Harpinder. This brings us to the end of this session, and we will have more time for discussion in the session to come. Just to conclude, I was really interested in the questions about stakeholder engagement, and then taking the studies and engaging stakeholders and policymakers. I think this is critical in terms of thinking through the theory of change, which will be discussed through a presentation by Peter tomorrow. But at the Global Alliance, we talk about a theory of transformation, and it occurs to me that the comparative studies are really useful, and part of what we want to amplify is not just the differences, but really highlighting the positive benefits and the co-benefits of some of the system choices that can be made. Just one final reflection is that this is really an iterative process, so it's very exciting to have these early studies. It was great to have the feeder studies even before the framework was developed, which informed the development of the framework. And certainly that was the case with the Conabio study. And so, you know, we need to build a community that can really learn from this work and synthesize it effectively and communicate it out to the broader world to have the impact that we seek. So with that, thank you very much, and please join me to thank our panelists.